Students, this is part 2 of our screencast on elections for Target 6.8 for AP Government. As you recall, last time, or in the first segment, we kind of laid out a framework for elections, and we introduced you to this timeline, which I think is a really effective way to kind of figure out how elections work. And remember, we have two types of elections, or election cycles: presidential elections, which come in every 2 years, and then we have midterm elections, which also come every 2 years, again kind of leapfrogging each other. What we want to do now is, for this screencast, is we want to break each election down and talk more specifically, or at least demonstrate kind of graphically, how primary elections and how general elections fit into this, or how the primary season and the general election season fits into this. So what we're going to do is we're going to take the 2008 presidential election. We're going to break this down into its two parts. The primary season, we can use kind of, again, a bracket to show you when the primary season takes place. So starting in January, the first states hold their primary elections. Now, the first two states that traditionally hold their elections first in the primary season, and just to kind of back up a little bit, each state determines when their primary is going to be held. That's done by the state legislature in each state. And so that's really up to the state legislature to determine that. And it just so happens that two states have kind of taken the lead in terms of the primary season. So starting in January, you have two states, Iowa and New Hampshire. Iowa actually has a caucus, and we'll maybe get into that just a little bit later. So New Hampshire is actually considered the first primary of the season, and usually theirs comes in the first week or two of January. And then each state holds their primary throughout the primary season. The primary season then ends in June. And there's no absolute rule or law for this. It's just, again, kind of when the states decide to hold their primaries. And generally speaking, in the past, it's been January to June. Interestingly enough, in the last few election cycles, Utah has been one of the last. In 2012, Utah held its primary, its Republican primary, is the very last primary election in the entire country. I'm not entirely sure why they did that. But again, this is the primary season. Let's try that again. All right, the second half of the presidential election is, again, what we would just call the general season. And this is where the two, or the candidates who have been nominated by or selected by their party in the primary season, this is where they're going to run against each other. Take, for example, presidential candidates. They're nominated in their primary season, and they win the party's nomination, and then those candidates face off against each other in the general season. Okay, so just as with a presidential election, a midterm election is also can be kind of broken down into two parts. Again, you have the primary season, and you have the general season. Remember, a midterm election, you don't have a president running for office, but you do have other elected officials, members of the House, and some members of the Senate. Again, depending on the rotation we talked about earlier. So the primary season and the general season. And just like as with the presidential election, The primary season for a midterm election is going to start in January and roughly will end in June. You also have the election in November. Get this right. You don't have the big national conventions like we talked about earlier on the other part of the timeline because you don't have a president elected. The conventions only apply to presidential candidates. You don't have the same thing with members of Congress. One thing I will say about the primary season in 2010, just to give you something of a little more of a local part of this, is let's take, for example, Utah, and you have the incumbent, Bob Bennett. Bob Bennett was a senator for the state of Utah for a lot of years and was running again in the Republican primary. But he was actually defeated by Mike Lee in the primaries. And then Mike Lee goes on to win the general election. And as you probably know, if in Utah is generally considered what is known as a one-party state. That means that one party pretty much dominates politics, and of course that's the Republican Party. So once Mike Lee wins in the general election, once he wins in the primary election, then he's pretty much a shoo-in in the general season. And I can't even tell you off the top of my head who his Democratic opponent was in the general election. So again, you see the same kind of things with primaries and the parties selecting their candidates and so forth. Okay, let's move over then to give you one other example of how this works. Now again, here we're talking about a presidential election, the last one in 2012. So we have our primary season and our general election season. Again, January to June, and in November, the actual election. Okay, you have your party conventions. In this last presidential election cycle, the Republicans held their convention in Tampa Bay, Florida, and the Democrats held theirs in North Carolina, I believe, if memory serves me. Okay, just to kind of lay out again who the candidates were in 2012. Republicans had Mitt Romney and others, as I've already mentioned before, who was the Republican nominee, and the Democrats, of course, chose Obama. So that's the 2012 election cycle. Of course, Obama goes on to win the general election against Mitt Romney. But also, as you recall, with going back to our idea of presidential terms, once Barack Obama wins in 2012, then he starts his second term, and so once his term is up in 2016, he cannot run again. So the Democrats will have to find someone else. Let me mention one other thing here in regards to kind of how the elections work. So as I said, the general election takes place the first Tuesday of November. And there's kind of a time frame here, and this is what you'll actually get in 2016 in that election, is you'll get a time frame here where the president is actually what we call a lame duck president. Okay? And it's this period right in here. So George W. Bush, for example, was the lame duck president when he finished his second term of office back in 2008. Barack Obama had become the president, or was elected president, and that we actually have a term for a president or for a candidate who's been elected president. They're referred to as the president-elect. Okay, let me try that again. And so they are the president-elect in this time period between November and the time they actually take office. Okay. Let me just mention one other thing on this timeline. It's right in here. It's actually January 20th. But we have the celebration and the formal ceremony that we call the inauguration. And that's where the president-elect stands on the steps of the Capitol building and facing out towards what is known as the mall. That's that large kind of rectangular area where they can fit millions of people there. And the president, in front of that large crowd and in front of people watching on TV, takes the oath of office, where he swears to faithfully uphold the law and execute the duties of the presidency. All right, let's move on to the last part of our timeline. It's not really part of our timeline, but just to bring you up to this part. And the question here is, as we're approaching the next election cycle in 2014, this will be, of course, hopefully you can get this by now, this will be a midterm election. And we're also looking forward to 2016, which will be a presidential election. The big question for the 2014 midterm elections, and if you students are going to be 18 by next fall, you have to be 18 by November, then you can actually register to vote and vote in that midterm election. But the big question for the midterm elections in 2014, quite simply, is who will control the Senate. This probably stands to reason the Republicans will hold the House, they'll hold a majority in the House, but the Senate becomes the real question. Right now, the Republicans have 45 seats, the Democrats, give or take with the independents, they have about 55 seats, and Republicans would love to get some of those seats back so they could also control the Senate, but that remains to be seen. Moving over to 2016, again, it's anybody's guess right now who the Republican or the Democratic nominee are going to be. There is some speculation. Right now it looks like the person who's kind of the most hopeful in terms of winning the Republican nomination is the governor of New Jersey, Chris Christie. Not exactly a household name, but he's pretty popular in politics in a fairly liberal, or at least a more liberal-leaning state of the state of New Jersey, but he's been the Republican governor. Of course, on the Democratic side, the big talk is Hillary Clinton. She has not officially said, none of these have actually officially said they're going to do it, but there's a lot of people who feel like Hillary Clinton is kind of planning and preparing for a presidential run in 2016, and that would be very interesting. All right, students, that's elections for you. Again, using the screencast, you'll want to fill out the election timeline that you have in your study guide, and make sure you know the terms. Hopefully I've covered everything there, but hopefully you know the terms and you can get a little better idea how elections work. All right, thanks for watching.